The morning fog rolled over the mountains in the distance, and the first glimmer of the sun peeked above the trees and kissed the valley below. Young Caty was the first of her siblings to climb down from the upper loft in the rustic cabin. Her mother, Lovis, had already begun to prepare the morning breakfast. One by one, the children piled into the kitchen and gathered around that old table, eager for fresh biscuits. There was even a smell of bacon in the air. Caty always sat at the end of the table, opposite of her pa, since she was only 5 years old. Despite her age, she was already a hard worker, and her father, James, knew it would be a busy day. Well rested from yesterday's church services, he was anxious to get into the fields for an early start for what was sure to be a long day. It was the final hoeing of the year for the large crop of corn. "You 4 boys fetch the shovels and the rakes out of the lean-to. I'm gonna head out and hook up the mules. Those clouds look like falling weather. We'll be here in the next couple days, and I reckon this'll be our last chance to get that corn ready for the harvest," the father said. "Caty, finish up your grub and help your ma." "Yes, Pa," she replied. Truth be told, though, Caty longed to be big enough to go out in the field with the boys. In her young mind, there was freedom out there on the farm, and what a farm it was. James Sage had acquired a land grant of 400 acres in Grayson County, Virginia, as payment for serving twice in the Revolution. Yet, Caty knew to mind her pa, and it was a fact that her mother needed all the help she could get, raising a large pioneer family isolated on the frontier that was still contested by the natives. Before long, the chores of the day were underway. Once the cabin was clean, Caty and her mother took a large iron kettle to the creek that ran behind the house. The curious girl walked barefoot along the water, fetching broken branches, sticks, and twigs to fuel the fire underneath the primitive washing machine. "Stay here and tend to the fire while I fetch the clothes from the house. I'll be back directly," the mother directed. "Yes, ma'am," the mountain child replied. Caty stood still beside the huge pot of hot water and watched her mother walk towards the homestead until she faded into the morning fog. Yet, as her mother walked, something inside her compelled her to look over her shoulder, back at the young girl who had already abandoned the iron kettle and was running towards the hayfield, chasing a group of butterflies. "Oh, Caty," she smiled. "Such a curious and adventurous soul." However, things aren't always as they seem, even in this mountain oasis. You see, there was something else hiding in the fog on this morning at the edge of the woods. Something evil, some unknown stranger, both desperate and harboring unthinkable intentions. And there he waited, silently watching the young girl and waiting for just the right chance to steal her. And, unknown to Lovis, this would be the last time she would ever see her daughter. As young Caty chased the butterflies, a desperate outlaw snatched the young girl. She tried to scream, but he held his hand over her mouth and throat tightly. His hands were rough as sandpaper on her face. "If you make a sound, I'll kill you and your ma," the outlaw demanded. Within seconds, he threw Caty on his horse and disappeared into the dark woods. It was only a few minutes when Lovis arrived back at the creek with the family's laundry. It was eerily quiet, with the only sound being the crackling of the burning wood from the fire. "Caty!" she called. Over and over, up and down the creek she ran, becoming more frantic by the second, but she was nowhere to be found. Gripped with unthinkable fear, she fetched the girl's father, and the search continued all day until both the valley and the ridges were submerged into darkness. The next day, the search continued with all the neighbors joining in the search, but there was no trace of Caty. The 5-year-old girl had vanished into thin air. Unknown to Caty's family, the kidnapper had gagged and bound the child, and he had taken his victim far into the rugged terrain, traveling on horseback for hours through the old Indian trails and along the creek beds. In less than an hour, they had traveled nearly 4 miles when they arrived at Taylor's Mill Falls, where the scared child was forced to climb the steep rocks to the top of the waterfall. Once they reached the top, the desperado continued with the stolen child to the top of Big Ridge Mountain before reaching a small gap to escape to the other side of the mountain range. By now, the outlaw was confident that he had escaped with his young victim and was no longer concerned with her calling for help, so he removed the gag from her mouth. Completely stricken with fear, Caty was too afraid to even speak. "Where is he taking me? Will anyone ever find me?" she thought. By now, they had traveled nearly 8 miles from Caty's home, completely on the other side of the mountain ridge. It was clear that this bandit knew his way through the forest. Following Kilm's branch all the way to it joined Middle Fox Creek, the unknown man stopped just enough to water his horse and commanded Caty to drink from the creek. Within minutes, the rest was over, and the pair pushed on through the Laurel and the Greenbrier, 4 more miles until Fox Creek widened out a bit, but was still shallow enough to be forded by a horse, and the horse had been ridden hard. By the time they reached Wilson's Creek, the kidnapper had traveled 16 miles from Caty's home in the span of only 5 hours. By now, it was just past 1 p.m. They crisscrossed Wilson's Creek for another 2 miles before resting at Hilton Creek. The trail began upward again as they climbed a new set of ridges and bluffs, past Horse Creek and the North Fork of the New River. The only thing that could stop the outlaw proved to be the darkness. By the time nightfall arrived, Caty's parents had spent the entire day looking for her desperately on their family farm. Yet the scared child was now over 30 miles away from her home. Caty was too scared to even eat the food that she was offered. Imagine for a moment what was going through her mind. The entire day, traveling through unknown land, it seemed it would be impossible for her to ever find her way home. The kidnapper wasn't going to take any chance on Caty slipping away during the night, so he tied her hands together by her waist, and he wrapped a blanket around her and tied a rope around the blanket tightly so that the frightened child couldn't move. He then tied the other end of the rope to a small tree, and then he laid his bed on top of the rope. It was impossible for her to even try to escape. Caty passed out from exhaustion, and sunrise came quickly, and the two were on the move again, following the New River. Within a few hours, they reached the Virginia state line. Just like that, within 24 hours of her abduction, little Caty had been smuggled to a small Cherokee trading outpost in Tennessee. Caty had never seen Native Americans before. She couldn't understand the strange way they were dressed. Even the children. This outpost wasn't a permanent home. Instead, it was a marketplace of sorts, where the natives traded with the white man. Now, Caty didn't know it, but it was in that moment that the man who kidnapped her traded her to the Cherokees for a horse. Suddenly, she was surrounded by everyone speaking in a language she couldn't understand. All the native children just stared at her. The entire situation seemed completely unreal, yet there she was, hopeless and helpless. An Indian squaw fed the child jerky and corn, and that night, Caty made a pallet on the floor next to these strange Cherokee children. Still completely emotionally, spiritually, and physically exhausted, she collapsed into sleep. The moment she closed her eyes, sunrise came again. The entire group of natives consisted of less than 20 men, women, and children. Caty was the only white girl in the group. Although she was completely worn out from the travel of the 2 previous days, the group mounted horses and headed north. For the next 4 days, they traveled through Tennessee and Virginia following the New River, only stopping to water their horses and camp. On the 5th day, the group reached a place called the Narrows in Virginia, where they loaded everyone onto 3 canoes. Young Caty had never even seen a boat before, but for the next 5 days, they traveled nearly 200 miles down the New River and then the Kanawha River through some of the most untamed wilderness known to any white man. Some of the waters were so treacherous, they were forced to carry the canoes for miles at a time before returning to the water. Onward through West Virginia until the Kanawha poured into the mighty Ohio River. And so it was. 24 days after she was stolen from her mother and her father, the young girl arrived in the nation of the Wyandot Indians in Ohio. The Cherokee Indians brought her before the Wyandot chief, Tarhi. The wise old man was instantly fascinated by the white girl with blue eyes and blonde hair. The chief had a lengthy discussion with the Cherokee regarding how they had come in possession of the white girl. Satisfied with their answers, the chief accepted Caty as a gift from the Cherokee warriors. From this moment on, young Caty would be called Euroquains and was officially a Wyandot Indian, as if their blood flowed through her veins. Back home, Caty's father was devastated from her disappearance. He had completely abandoned his crops, and he spent the entire month looking for her, day and night, even when all others had given up hope. Now, back in those days, when all options were exhausted, it was common for folks to consult a mountain witch, women who could foretell the future. And during this era, the most famous granny witch that there was Granny Moses. She was legendary in her predictions, so much so that folks feared her. But James had no choice. He had to know what happened to Caty, so he traveled from the family farm in Virginia over the mountains to North Carolina. The old woman listened to his story, and when he was finished speaking, there was silence. The mountain witch just stared into his eyes, as if she was looking into his soul. James backed away towards the door to leave when she suddenly spoke. "Your little girl is alive and well, but you will never know her fate or see her again till the day you die. However, one day in the far future, your wife will learn of your daughter's fate and her location, but she too will die before she ever lays eyes on her again." The woman's words tore his heart right from his chest, and part of him died right then and there in that small cabin. Just like that, her family gave up all hope of ever finding her. Within a few years, Euroquains' mind had completely blocked out the first 5 years of her life. She did her best to forget about her blood siblings, even her ma and her pa. As terrible as this entire tragedy had been, she was lucky to have ended up with the Wyandot Indians. They had a well-known reputation for being kind to their captives, and this was especially true for Euroquains. From the moment she arrived, everyone from children to men to women admired her, and as she grew, she became a beautiful teenager. And when she was 17 years old, she was married to Chief Tarhi, the same chief who had accepted her as a gift from the Cherokees. Somehow, through the most unlikely of journeys, the young Euroquains was now the queen of the Wyandot nation. And so it was. She lived her entire life with the Wyandot tribe. She would marry 3 times, once to a great warrior and twice to chiefs. In 1817, she was granted a portion of the 148,000 acres of land in Ohio by the United States government in the Treaty of the Wyandot. She became a wise, respected leader of the Wyandot nation. And as the United States continued to steal Native American land, the natives, including the Wyandots, were forced westward. Euroquains and her people eventually moved to Kansas. Her life had taken her from her blood family in Virginia at 5 years old. She had spent the next 56 years living as one of the Wyandot Indians, serving as their queen, when one day, something very strange happened. On March 10th, 1848, the queen was approached by a Wyandot interpreter. He told her that he had met a mysterious white man who had a striking resemblance to Euroquains. Even his voice was similar. The white man had told him that once he had a sister, but she disappeared when she was 5 years old, and that he had never seen her or heard from her again. But that was over 50 years ago, he said. You see, it turns out that Caty's brother, Charles Sage, was a trader working for a large company, and his work had taken him from his home in Virginia all the way out to Kansas. Euroquains was stunned. She had locked all those memories away inside of her decades ago. She could barely remember her siblings, or her mother or her father. She didn't even know how to speak English anymore. Yet, something inside of her must have remembered, and it compelled her to arrange a meeting with this white man. A couple of weeks later, the meeting took place. There the Wyandot Queen stood, face to face with her long-lost brother, a stranger who she had never really known. An interpreter was present as both the Native American queen and her white brother asked many questions of each other. She could only remember that she was kidnapped by a white man. She had erased all the memories as a defense mechanism. Charles Sage was convinced that Euroquains was his sister. A few weeks later, he visited again, this time bringing his older brother, Samuel, who was 11 years old when the young Caty disappeared. He recognized her immediately and verified a scar on her leg and her back from a burn she had when she was young. "We have to tell you something," the brother stated. "Our mother, your mother, is still alive, and she still lives at our family home in Virginia, the exact spot where you were kidnapped. We've told her about you, and we've never seen her cry so many tears of joy. She wants to see you, and we've made arrangements for you to travel from Kansas to Virginia, if you will agree to come." The proposition was met with a long silence as the woman, wise beyond her years, who had endured so much and traveled so far, entered deep thought. For her, life's journey had come full circle. She realized that in her white brother's mind, she was forever frozen in time as a young girl named Caty. They had so many questions, and they had carried a burden of sorrow for her in their hearts their entire lives. So too had her mother, who even in the last years of her life still held on to her love for Caty. After some time, she finally spoke aloud. "I have two families. One that brought me into this world and loved me, and I loved them, but I lost them long ago. It is impossible for me to do as you ask, for I must stay here with my people, for they were my children, and I, Euroquains, am their grandmother." And just like that, just like the Granny Witch had predicted nearly a half a century earlier, Caty Sage's father would die before ever learning of his daughter's fate. And although Caty's mother eventually learned her daughter's story, she never saw her again in her lifetime.